The rain poured down in heavy sheets, drowning out the sound of footsteps on the slick pavement. A woman stood beneath a flickering streetlight, her fingers tightening around the edges of her coat as she stared up at the towering glass building in front of her. The logo at the top gleamed in the city lights, a company she once helped build, a life she once belonged to. But that was a long time ago, back when she was someone else, before the betrayal. Inside, the man who had once promised her forever was seated at the head of a long conference table. His suit was crisp, his watch expensive, and his confidence unwavering. He had everything: wealth, power, influence. Yet, beneath the polished surface, he was completely unaware that his past was about to walk through his doors. That the woman he had deceived, discarded, and forgotten was standing just outside, ready to step back into his world, but not as the person he once knew. Years ago, she had been the perfect wife, loyal, supportive, deeply in love. She believed in him, in their dreams, in the empire they were building together. But trust is a fragile thing, and when it shatters, the pieces can cut deeper than any blade. He had betrayed her in the worst possible way, leaving her with nothing but heartbreak and a name that no longer held any meaning. She disappeared without a trace, leaving behind whispers and unanswered questions. Now she was back, with a new name, a new face, and a new purpose. No longer the woman who had once waited for love to be enough. This time, she wasn't here for closure or revenge. No, she had something far bigger in mind, something that would shake his perfect world to its core. As she stepped through the revolving doors of the company, her heels clicked against the marble floors, a sound that echoed through the grand lobby. No one recognized her. Not the receptionist who used to greet her warmly, not the executives who had once smiled at her in meetings. She had erased every trace of her past self, crafted a new identity, and climbed her way back into the world she had been cast out from. And now she was closer than ever. He had no idea that the woman he was about to meet, the one with the sharp mind, the undeniable presence, and the mysterious past, was the same woman he had once tossed aside like an afterthought. But he would soon find out, because the past never stays buried forever. And this time, she was the one in control. She walked with purpose, her every step measured and confident. The polished floors reflected the soft glow of the overhead lights, and the faint hum of conversations filled the air. She blended in effortlessly, just another professional navigating the corporate world, except she wasn't just anyone. Her gaze swept the room, taking in the details that hadn't changed. The same modern design, the same sleek glass partitions, the same scent of freshly brewed coffee drifting from the break room. It was all so familiar, yet foreign at the same time. This place had once been her home. She had walked these halls as a different woman, one who had believed in love, in loyalty, in the man who had built this empire with her. But that woman was gone. She adjusted the cuffs of her tailored blazer and made her way toward the receptionist's desk. The young woman behind it barely looked up, typing away on her keyboard. "Good morning," she said smoothly. "I have a meeting scheduled with the CEO." The receptionist finally glanced up, giving her a polite but dismissive nod before checking the system. "Your name, please?" She hesitated for only a fraction of a second before saying it. The name that wasn't hers, but had become a part of her. A name carefully chosen, legally documented, one that carried no ties to the past. The receptionist typed it in, scanning the screen. "Ah, yes. You're on the list. Please take the elevator to the top floor. Someone will be there to escort you." "Thank you." She turned, keeping her expression neutral as she walked toward the elevator. The moment she stepped inside, she let out a slow breath, steadying herself as the doors slid shut. The number panel glowed as she pressed the top button, and the soft hum of the elevator filled the silence. She was really doing this. As the elevator climbed, her mind drifted back to the past, to the moment everything had fallen apart. She had loved him. more than she ever thought she could love another person. She had been there from the very beginning, back when he was just another ambitious man with a dream, fighting to make something of himself. They had built this company together, late nights spent working side by side, sacrifices made in the name of success. She had believed in their future, in the life they were creating. And then, one moment had shattered it all. She still remembered the coldness in his eyes, the way he had dismissed her as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. The betrayal had cut deeper than she ever thought possible. It hadn't just been about infidelity, about broken vows. No, it had been so much worse. He had taken everything from her, her trust, her stability, her very identity. He had rewritten history, erasing her role in their success, casting her aside like she had been nothing more than a stepping stone. And now, he had no idea she was standing in the same building he ruled over. No idea that she had clawed her way back, reinvented herself, and positioned herself in a place where she could shake the very foundation of everything he had built. The elevator dinged softly, and the doors slid open. A man in a sharp suit stood waiting for her. He extended a polite hand. "Right this way, please." She nodded, following him down the long corridor. The tension in her chest grew tighter with every step. At the end of the hall, the double doors loomed large, the gold lettering on the glass, spelling out a name that once would have made her heart race for an entirely different reason. She had whispered that name in the quiet of the night. She had signed it next to hers on documents, contracts, vows. But now, it was nothing more than a reminder of who he was, a man who had taken what he wanted without hesitation, a man who had no idea what was about to come. The doors opened, and there he was, seated at the massive desk, leaning back in his chair, exuding the same effortless confidence he always had. He glanced up, expecting another meeting, another forgettable interaction in his busy day. But the moment his eyes met hers, something shifted. A flicker of recognition. A ghost of something buried deep. She smiled, stepping forward, extending a perfectly steady hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you," she said, her voice smooth and unreadable. He took her hand, his grip firm, but his eyes studied her, searching, questioning. He didn't know. Not yet. But he would. And when he did, everything he thought he knew would come crashing down. His grip lingered for just a second longer than necessary before he released her hand. His expression remained composed, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of familiarity he couldn't quite place. She could see the gears turning in his mind, the way his gaze briefly narrowed, as if trying to pull a memory from the depths of his past. But he wouldn't find it. Not yet. She had changed too much. Her face, her voice, her entire presence, it was all carefully crafted to be someone new. A woman who commanded respect, who carried herself with an air of quiet power. The woman he had once known had been softer, more trusting, more willing to believe in him. That woman no longer existed. "Please, have a seat," he said, his voice smooth, practiced. He gestured to the chair across from him, the same chair where she had once sat countless times before, back when this office had felt like home. Now it felt foreign, sterile, like the man sitting before her. She lowered herself into the chair with effortless composure, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with me. I know you're a busy man." He gave a small, polite nod, but his eyes studied her carefully. "I like to make time for interesting opportunities. And from what I've heard, you're someone worth meeting." She smiled, tilting her head slightly. "I hope to prove that." There was a beat of silence, a subtle tension hanging in the air. He leaned back in his chair, fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "Your background is impressive. I read through your proposal, smart, strategic. You clearly understand how this industry works. But I have to admit, there's something familiar about you." Her heart pounded for just a fraction of a second, but she didn't let it show. Instead, She let out a small, knowing chuckle. I get that a lot. People tend to think they've met me before. Maybe I just have one of those faces. His lips pressed into a thin line, his expression unreadable. But he let it go. For now. Tell me, he said, shifting the conversation. What made you interested in working with us? She leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. I admire what you've built here. Your company has positioned itself as a leader in the industry, and I believe there's still untapped potential. I have ideas that could elevate it even further. He nodded, but his gaze remained sharp, assessing. He was used to people coming to him with offers, proposals, partnerships. He had learned to read between the lines, to spot hidden motives. But he had never expected that the biggest deception of all would be sitting right in front of him, looking him in the eye. As they spoke, she couldn't help but study him just as intently. He was still the same, in so many ways, the way he carried himself, the way he commanded a room without effort. But there were differences too. The faint lines at the corners of his eyes, the slightly deeper set of his jaw. Time had changed him. She wondered if life had ever humbled him, if he had ever looked back at what he had done and felt even a shred of regret. She doubted it. But she wasn't here to find out. She was here to rewrite the narrative, to take back what had been stolen from her. And he had no idea. The meeting stretched on, filled with discussions about strategies and market trends. But beneath the surface, a game was unfolding, one only she knew the rules to. By the time they stood to shake hands, she could see that he was intrigued by her. Interested. He saw her as someone valuable, someone he could use. Good. That was exactly what she wanted. As she left the office, she caught her reflection in the glass walls. The woman staring back at her was a stranger to the world that had once known her. And that was her greatest weapon. This was only the beginning. The days that followed moved quickly. Each step was calculated, each interaction carefully planned. She knew she had his attention now. He was watching her, studying her, trying to figure out what made her different from everyone else who had walked through his doors. And that was exactly what she wanted. She could feel the pull, the way he leaned in just slightly whenever they spoke, the way his gaze lingered a second too long. It wasn't attraction. No, this was something else. Curiosity. A sense of familiarity that he couldn't quite place. She could see it in the way his brows furrowed when she said certain things, the way he paused when she laughed, as if something about her voice triggered a memory just out of reach. But he didn't know. Not yet. She had woven herself into his world seamlessly, moving through meetings, networking with his top executives, making herself indispensable. Every conversation, every decision brought her closer to the heart of his empire. The company they had once built together, except now, he had no idea she was reclaiming it, piece by piece. The tension between them grew thicker with each passing day. She knew he felt it too, though he didn't understand why. There were moments when he would stare at her, as if searching for something, as if his mind was trying to solve a puzzle that didn't quite fit. But he couldn't place it, and she wasn't going to help him. She wanted him to doubt himself. She wanted him to feel the same confusion, the same sense of something slipping through his fingers that she had once felt when he shattered her life without a second thought. And then, one evening, everything shifted. It was late. The office had mostly emptied out, leaving only the faint hum of computers and the occasional murmur of distant conversations. She had been reviewing reports when she heard his voice behind her. "You work late." She turned, meeting his gaze. He stood at the doorway of her temporary office, leaning against the frame, with that same effortless confidence. But there was something else in his eyes tonight. Something deeper. "I believe in putting in the work," she said smoothly, closing the folder in front of her. He stepped inside, letting the door click shut behind him. "I've been meaning to ask you something." She tilted her head slightly, waiting. He studied her, his eyes dark with something unreadable. Do I know you? For a moment, she let the silence stretch between them, let the weight of the question hang in the air. Then she smiled, shaking her head lightly. I don't believe we've met before. He didn't look convinced. It's strange. Something about you feels familiar. Like I should remember. She met his gaze without hesitation, her expression unreadable. Maybe I just remind you of someone from your past. He exhaled softly, running a hand through his hair. Maybe, but his tone said he wasn't sure. A beat passed, tension filling the space between them. Then, as if shaking off the thought, he gave her a small smirk. Either way, I'm glad you're here. You're making an impression. That's my goal, she replied smoothly. As he left, she watched him go, her pulse steady, her expression calm. He was close now, too close. But that was exactly what she wanted. Because soon, he wouldn't just suspect. He would know. And when that moment came, everything he thought he had control over would come crashing down. The days blurred into nights, the tension between them growing heavier with each passing moment. She could see it in the way he watched her now, the way his eyes lingered just a second too long whenever she spoke. He wasn't just intrigued anymore, he was unsettled. He was starting to feel it, that quiet, nagging voice in the back of his mind, whispering that something wasn't right, that she wasn't who she claimed to be. And yet, he couldn't quite place it. That was the beauty of it. She had crafted this identity too carefully, erased every trace of the woman he had once known. The name, the past, the story, everything had been rewritten. She was untouchable, just out of reach, leaving him grasping at something he couldn't quite remember. And the more he tried, the more it slipped through his fingers. Then, just when she thought she had complete control, something happened that she hadn't planned for. A name she hadn't heard in years. She was in the middle of a meeting when she heard it, spoken casually by one of the senior executives as they flipped through reports. Her breath caught for just a fraction of a second, so quick, no one noticed, but her mind raced. That name belonged to someone from her past. Someone who had known her before she disappeared. Someone who could recognize her. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep her expression unreadable. But inside, the ground beneath her had shifted. After the meeting, she made her way back to her office, her hands steady, but her mind spinning. She needed to find out more. If this person was back in the picture, it could change everything. That night, she stayed late, digging through files, searching for anything that could tell her why this person's name had resurfaced after all this time. And then she found it: a business deal. A potential partnership. Her stomach tightened. If this deal went through, that person would be walking through the same door she had walked through weeks ago. They would see her, look her in the eye, and they would know. She had spent years preparing for this moment, for the confrontation that was coming with the man who had betrayed her. But she hadn't prepared for this. Because if this person recognized her before she was ready, before she had completed what she came here to do, it could all fall apart. She sat back in her chair, her pulse steady, but her mind racing. She had to act fast. The wall she had so carefully built around her identity was starting to crack. And for the first time since she had walked through these doors, she realized that she wasn't just playing the game anymore. She was running out of time. The air inside the office felt heavier than usual. The weight of what was coming pressed against her chest, but she had spent too much time planning, too much time waiting, to let doubt slip in now. Every piece was in place, every move calculated. She was ready. But then, something happened that she hadn't expected. She was walking down the hallway, her heels clicking against the polished floors, when she saw him. The man from her past, the one who could recognize her. He was standing just outside the conference room, shaking hands with executives, his familiar smile sharp as ever. For a split second she froze. Then his eyes met hers. Something flickered across his face: confusion, disbelief. She saw it happen in real time, the way his smile faltered, the way his brows pulled together, as if his mind was trying to catch up with what his eyes were telling him. She forced herself to keep walking, her pulse steady, even as adrenaline flooded her system. If she stopped, if she hesitated, it would be over. But he turned. Wait. The single word cut through the air, sending a ripple of awareness through the space. The other executives turned to look, curiosity flickering in their expressions. She exhaled slowly, then stopped, pivoting on her heel with a practiced, unreadable smile. Yes? His gaze locked onto hers, searching. She saw the exact moment he put the pieces together. His lips parted slightly, his breath hitching just enough for her to notice. "It's you," he murmured, just loud enough for her to hear. Her stomach clenched, but she didn't let it show. "I think you must be mistaken." He took a slow step toward her, shaking his head. "No, I know who you are." Silence stretched between them. And then, from behind her, another voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" She turned. And there he was. The man who had betrayed her. The man who had built this empire on the ruins of what they once had. He stood there, watching the exchange, his gaze flicking between them, suspicion creeping into his eyes. For the first time since she had stepped back into this world, she saw something else in his face. Doubt. He wasn't sure yet, but the seed had been planted. The air in the room shifted. Conversations died down. A quiet tension crackled through the space as the pieces of the past threatened to surface. Then, before anyone could speak again, she did the only thing she could do. She smiled, stepping forward, closing the distance between herself and the man who had nearly recognized her. "Perhaps we've met before," she said smoothly, tilting her head just slightly. "But people change, don't they?" For a moment, he just stared at her. Then, to her relief, he gave a slow, uncertain nod. She turned back to the CEO, the man she had once loved, once trusted. He was still watching her, his expression unreadable, but she could see the tension in his posture, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. It was working. The foundation beneath him was starting to crack. And then, just as she thought she had control again, he said something that sent a chill down her spine. "I did some digging." The words were quiet, careful. Her breath caught. "I knew there was something about you I couldn't shake," he continued, stepping closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "And now I know why." She held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Do you?" she asked, her tone smooth, steady. He smirked, but there was no amusement in it. "You really thought I wouldn't figure it out?" Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, but her expression remained composed. "I have no idea what you're talking about." He leaned in, close enough that only she could hear what came next. "You were never good at lying," he murmured. The floor beneath her seemed to tilt. For the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt since stepping into this building. Fear. He knew. Maybe not everything. Maybe not the full extent of what she had planned. But he knew enough. She had spent years building this moment, carefully crafting every move. And now, it was all about to come crashing down. Her pulse pounded in her ears, but she refused to show it. She had come too far, planned too carefully, to let one moment undo everything. The way he looked at her, now intense, knowing it was different from before. He wasn't just suspicious anymore. He was certain. For the first time since she had stepped back into his world, the power had shifted. And she had to take it back. She straightened, lifting her chin slightly. "If you think you know something, why don't you just say it?" Her voice was smooth, controlled. He studied her for a long moment, then smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I wanted to see if you'd admit it first." She forced a small laugh. "Admit what?" His gaze sharpened. "That you're not who you say you are." The words hung between them, charged and heavy. She felt the quiet in the room pressing in, even as voices murmured in the distance, as footsteps echoed down the hallway. She had expected this confrontation, but not here, not now. She had planned to be the one in control when the truth came out. And yet she could feel it slipping. "I don't know what kind of theory you've come up with," she said, keeping her voice even. "But I've built my career on my own, and I don't have time for it." "Enough." His voice was quiet but firm, and something about it made her stop. He took a slow step closer, lowering his voice even further. "You thought you could fool me. You changed everything, your name, your face, your past, but you forgot one thing." Her throat tightened. He leaned in slightly, his next words cutting through the air like a blade. "I never forget the way someone looks at me when they hate me." A breath caught in her throat, but she swallowed it down, refusing to let it show. His eyes never left hers. "I see it now. The way you hold yourself, the way you speak. It was right in front of me the whole time." She forced herself to stay calm. "You sound paranoid." His lips pressed together in a thin line. "Maybe, but I'm right." The moment stretched between them. A quiet, unspoken battle. Then he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "So tell me," he said, his voice quieter now, almost unreadable. "Why are you really here?" For the first time since she had returned, she felt the walls closing in. She could keep denying it. She could try to spin another lie. But she was tired. Years of hiding, of planning, of rebuilding herself only for this moment. And now it had arrived, and she realized something she hadn't before. She didn't want to keep pretending. Her fingers curled at her sides. "You don't get to ask that." His brow furrowed slightly. "Excuse me? You don't get to stand here and act like you're the victim," she said, her voice steady but edged with something raw. "You don't get to demand answers when you never gave any yourself." His jaw tightened. "I built this company. You built it on the ashes of what you destroyed," she cut in. A flicker of something, guilt, flashed across his face, but it was gone just as quickly. He shook his head. "You disappeared. You left." She let out a hollow laugh. "You know exactly why." The silence that followed was suffocating. For the first time, he didn't have a response. She had imagined this confrontation so many times. She had thought it would feel like justice, like closure. But now that it was happening, all she felt was exhaustion. Because the truth was, no matter what she said, no matter what he admitted or didn't, the past couldn't be undone. She had won in so many ways. She had forced her way back into his world, made him see her again, made him realize that he hadn't destroyed her. But revenge wasn't what she wanted anymore. She had outgrown it. She took a slow breath. "I don't need anything from you," she said finally. Not an apology, not an explanation. Nothing. His expression flickered with something unreadable. "Then what do you want?" She smiled, but it wasn't out of amusement. It was because, for the first time in years, she had an answer. To walk away. He stared at her, and for the first time, she saw something unexpected in his eyes. Regret. She turned before he could say anything else. And as she walked down the hallway, she felt it, the weight lifting, the past unraveling behind her, fading into something distant. She had come here for revenge, but she was leaving with something better. Freedom.